let's get to our first talk today. Our first talk takes a look at America's expectations for privacy. Now, after surveying 2,000 Americans, two key insights were revealed. You're going to hear more about those. But the two insights were that people want privacy but don't trust institutions. Surprise, surprise. And that lack of trust expands to blockchain technology. Here to unpack more about what Americans expect today and for the future when it comes to their privacy, I'd like to welcome to the stage Aleo Foundation Head of Policy and CSO Lena Im with Aleo Foundation Executive Director Alex Pruden.
Good to see some familiar faces. Thank you all very much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. As you just heard, we actually commissioned a survey for Morning Consult where we surveyed 2,000 Americans to really understand what is their perspective on privacy. We all know about the privacy paradox, but like, what's really happening? Are they open to new ideas? Is there any desire for new tech that might actually protect their privacy? Like, what's going on? So we commissioned this, and we wanted to share some of the findings with you all. But before we start, Alex, how has ETHDenver been so far?
Well, I was just having a conversation about where the old venue was at the old sports arcade, kind of closer to downtown, and it's amazing to see how much it's grown. And so my experience this year has been, similar to last year, where almost overwhelmed by the amount of interest and the number of people that are interested in this technology in the space. It's hard to grasp that even just a few years ago, I remember like a venue a tenth the size of the Western Center there was not even filled to capacity. And so it's really cool to be a part of something and part of an industry that's grown as much as it has over the last couple of years.
What's one of the most interesting conversations you've had? And what's one of the dumbest conversations you've had thus far?
Those are two great questions. I think some of the interesting conversations that I've had revolve around, and I think, zkTalks, I'm sure we're going to talk more about this today in other panels, but I think those are really interesting. I've had some conversations about a bit of a divergence in how zk tech is potentially going to be applied. I think there's increasingly two views. One is a view where clients should have the ability to generate proofs themselves on device or permissionlessly, and the other view is that most of the real work will happen in a server, and because that's where the proofs are compute intensive, that like the server is going to be the preferred approach. But in some cases, I think some protocols are adopting this view where the server is kind of the only approach, right? So, and maybe that's fine if you're a client because you can, cryptographically verify. But there's a slight and subtle distinction around who can generate the proofs or where the proofs are thought to, are going to live. So that's been the more interesting conversation. Dumb conversation. I don't know. I saw a tweet this morning, which I'm just going to cite it. It was from Tarun Chitra. For those of you who don't know Tarun, he's my favorite physicist / mathematician to follow on Twitter, a longtime crypto guy. And he said he overheard an undergrad student saying, if you put the Riz in ZK, you have $1 billion. So I don't know. Maybe that was the smartest comment. I'm not sure.
Truth in that, yeah. Amazing. Well, diving into our survey, we found pretty interesting numbers, but they shouldn't surprise us, right? So 60% of folks our survey respondents said they don't trust institutions for privacy. I believe 10% said they don't have that much trust in the blockchain for privacy. So Alex, I actually want to start out with a question around how did we get here, where we are with privacy, both in traditional platforms and also with blockchain? How are we in this current state of privacy kind of morass or lack of privacy?
I think we're at the state that we are, and I think maybe just it's worth it to stop and say where we are. I think, certainly in blockchain crypto today, virtually every single platform is, public by default. So any interaction on Bitcoin or Ethereum or any blockchain or even layer 2 typically ends up getting posted to a public ledger that lives for all time, that anyone can search and view. That's the state of things in crypto, and the state of things in kind of Web 2 or the traditional web aren't much better. As things have transitioned from kind of browsers to apps, a lot of apps on phones have much more fine-grained abilities to track and see where people are going and what they're doing and what their interactions are. So that's where we are. I think we got there largely because I think the pace at which the internet and mobile technology and blockchain technology has advanced, is such that people focused on kind of these features around usability first, and creating new and interesting use cases. But I think the consequences of this new paradigm were kind of assumed to be minimal, and therefore no one really cared that much at first. But now I've gotten to the point where I do think they affect things a lot, and it's particularly in blockchain, since we're here at a blockchain conference. Look, I think my personal view is that most crypto use cases are gambling use cases today, casino use cases. And I think in a casino, no one really bothers to hide the number of chips they have, right? It's in some ways people like to advertise how many chips they've won at the casino. But I think, and so privacy isn't really important in that world. But I do think for real world use cases, like if you think about settling business contracts or even just taking a paycheck, actually, since this is I've gotten into a habit of asking this question, how many people in this room take 100% of their salary in crypto? Exactly, right? So we are all at a crypto conference. We know work in this industry, and by the way, I didn't raise my hand. No one takes 100% of their salary in crypto, largely because it effectively reveals what you make, and there's an expectation around societally not revealing that, right? So these are things that we can't do, not because the technology isn't able to. I can of course receive USDC, but I choose not to because that has implications for what I reveal to the world. So yeah, I think it's just kind of been we've crossed this threshold where these issues have become more and more important. And I think people are only just now starting to realize it.
I mean, given where we are and all this mistrust towards institutions, do you think, how do we get back to a place where there is more trust?
I think it's by empowering consumers and individuals to be able to verify things that institutions say and do. And I think that's one of the powerful things about crypto and blockchain broadly, beyond zero-knowledge cryptography. But the ability to see and verify in real time cryptographically, that money was moved or that a statement was valid in some way, shape, or form. And I think the ability for individuals to do that and to prove to each other, by the way, in a peer-to-peer manner that's been done, I think it's kind of paradoxical because I think some institutions and some, I would say, authorities view that as a threat. But I actually think the empowerment of individuals is what makes these systems more resilient overall. And I think you could make this, arguably this is one of the strengths of, actually, since we're talking about a panel of privacy in America, is there anyone in here who's not or doesn't consider themselves to be an American? Okay, so so we have a few people who are not American in here. So just to be clear, I am an American, so my views are obviously shaped by growing up here. And I've served in the Army, so I've kind of been maybe more, those views have been instilled in me more than maybe some other Americans. But yeah, look, I think this is something that I think a lot of, at least historians who look at the United States of America, what made it different than other countries, was there's kind of this desire for independence at the individual level and for people to have autonomy and liberty, right? And that was really what kind of defined it from other early democratic systems. And I think this is kind of just an extension of that philosophical idea.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because there's both this desire for American individual liberty, but there's this huge distrust in the technology that could provide that, right? So in our survey, only 10% said they trust blockchain. How do we bridge that gap, that real, how do you talk to your grandmother about this, kind of gap?
Yeah, well, I think it's because blockchain has become a very loaded word. I think blockchain, in a lot of people's minds, people are like, okay, blockchain, it's like Bitcoin, and what do I know about Bitcoin? My nephew got rich investing in it in 2014, mining it in his basement or something, right? And I think, there's still, to this day, a lot of emphasis on again, kind of these like more casino use cases, right? So the brand of the industry, the brand of blockchain is kind of looked at as this, it's almost like this get rich quickness of it. And I think this is one of the best and in some ways worst parts of the technology is that it marries very tightly the concept of value and the concept of, the internet or, near light speed communication, right? And inevitably that is going to attract people who aren't really that philosophically interested in, promoting liberty, but in fact are just more interested in making money. But it does create, it creates the ability to solve problems that aren't solvable before. Like we're going to get into this, I'm sure, but like one of my favorite use cases for the combination of ZK and blockchains particularly is identity. Like age verification is a simple example of that. Like if you want to go on the internet today, there's not a way to verify you're over a certain age or under a certain age or that you are who you say you are. I mean, anyone who's gone through a KYC process with an exchange, like it involves taking a picture of a physical document, right? Like it's there's things that we could do better with this technology, but that's not what most people talk about, and that's because I think just the brand of the space, the brand that that we all kind of inherited, is something different. And this is a point that maybe the last thing I'll say on this is I think this is an important thing to remember for everyone who's come to this space. I mean, first off, I love this space because it brings so many different kinds of unique people together. But I think it's important for people to express their beliefs and values about what this space is and should be, because I think if we don't do that, then the people that tend to speak the loudest are the people that talk about get-rich-quick schemes, and then we all inherit that brand from like my grandmother's perspective or someone else's perspective who's not in crypto.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Like, how do we build for more use cases? And building off of that, what are the other use cases that you're excited about for ZK and just privacy on the blockchain generally?
Yeah, I mean, the two immediate ones for me are really identity, and I think you have to start with identity, right? And this ability to be able to prove who you are without revealing, the details of your identity. And I think that, number one, solves, as I mentioned a second ago, unsolved problems on the web. So I think it has immediate utility beyond what people kind of broadly consider crypto to be useful for. But I also think from that basis, you can build a better, more secure financial system that allay a lot of the concerns that people have about crypto. I mean, one use case that I do think has gotten traction that's not a casino use case is stablecoins, right? Stablecoins have seen increasing adoption over the last three years specifically. But I think there's concern around how are those stablecoins are being used, who's transacting in them, where is that money going, and there's different countries, and certainly the U.S. has laws and regulations pertaining to how money can flow, right? And you're trying to prevent money from going in the wrong hands, and I think you can allay all those concerns by introducing some identity protocol at a lower level. Like just as a simple matter, like you could say, hey, you're only allowed to send USDC if you basically do a zero knowledge proof of a KYC every week or something like that. That would be a simple, it's kind of a simple solution. But to be clear, like that's actually better in terms of safer or more compliant than the way existing banks work, right? Existing banks, like if I could wire money to someone in North Korea right now, most, depending on their policies, like a lot of times they catch people doing things after the fact, right? But now I think you have the ability to prove correctness up front, and that's kind of the beautiful part about the cryptographic nature of the zero knowledge proofs. So I think financial use cases, I think blockchains in general have enormous financial utility that has not been able to fully be utilized because we've lacked this ability to do, basically permissionless proofs around who we are.
So do you see Aleo as kind of a bridge between Web 2 and Web 3? Because what you're describing are a lot of applications of what Aleo could do, or other blockchains like Aleo, onto a Web 2 infrastructure, right? So how do you see that dynamic?
Yeah, I think I kind of think of Web 3 as like this term that we're going to look back on as like something we just said in 2024, but like, cause it's like, I remember, I'm sadly of the, at this point, unlike most people attending this conference, I'm like, remember the birth of the internet and remember the first web browser. And there was a time when everyone was like, hey, I have an internet business. And like, no one says I have an internet business now. It's like obvious you have an internet business. every business is an internet business. And I think similarly, I think just the way we've seen crypto, like I said, this conference just as an indicator has grown massively over the last few years. I think, continuing on this trajectory as we continue to solve these problems, this technology is going to be more and more adopted into the internet. Because why? It's basically just allowing you to send value like you send an email. So I think that's going to become an inherent part of the web stack. And it's just part of it. So I think I view Aleo in that context in the same as the privacy layer for that value transfer. In the same way, like to use an analogy, when the internet, like the web kind of broadly, the World Wide Web kind of got popular with the first browser, Netscape, there wasn't encryption in the beginning. And therefore, there was a very limited ability to use the web for financial transactions. At the time, I remember my dad was like a big early web user. It was like all message boards. It was basically all Reddit, effectively, in a much more primitive version of Reddit. And Netscape pioneered SSL. And the first kind of the early encryption libraries that ultimately became like HTTPS and enabled HTTPS, right, to have secure encrypted transmissions over the web, and that enabled credit card transactions, and that is what really enabled the web to be what it is today, to be the thing that we all just assume every business is a web business. And I think my hope is that Aleo, by leveraging zero-knowledge cryptography, does the same thing for blockchain technology and makes it easier to integrate into that stack. It's the TLS or it's the SSL for blockchain.
Because I am the policy person for Aleo, I have to ask this question. How do you, it's a hard one, but how do Americans, from your point of view, perceive the role of government institutions and privacy? Because so much of it right now is after the fact, right? They're trying to rein in Meta after the fact. They're trying to rein in data, service providers after the fact. What do you see, or what do you think is the lay American's perception of what government should do in privacy, and what do you think Aleo or the blockchain community should do?
I cannot claim to speak for all Americans, but look, I think the sense that I get, and sometimes the way that I feel, is hopeless. Because it seems like the way things are is just broken. Like I said, I served in the U.S. Army. I had I have a security clearance, and the data that enabled me to get a security clearance, along with the data of millions of other Americans that got security clearances, was hacked. And this is I think 2011, right? And so it's not just like my social security number. It's like my fingerprints are somewhere on the dark web, and that's when something like that happens to you, or when Equifax gets hacked, and you're like, hey, sorry, you've lost your, someone hacked your account. We're giving you 3 months of LifeLock or something. You feel hopeless, right? It's just like, okay, well, where do I even start? How do I even think about where all my data is? I've clicked through all these, it's easy to feel hopeless. But I think increasingly, if you just look at regulation, and I think this, to be fair to people who are not Americans, I think Europe really led the way in a lot of the regulations. I think with the GDPR, I think the GDPR has some practical problems, particularly as it pertains to blockchain. As in, I have no idea how you comply with the GDPR if you have a blockchain, or at least a public blockchain. But I think that the idea behind it was really good, and you've started to see that be adopted. And obviously, California has kind of a similar regulation, and I think increasingly you're seeing elected officials and regulators pass laws that kind of try and give people some assurances around how their data is going to be used and what's going to be used for it. Now, I think, as I said, I think GDPR has problems mainly in its implementation. I think how Aleo fits into that is it gives people tools to be able to achieve those things, right? Like the ability to prove that I have a U.S. passport without showing my JPEG of it. That's something that can help people comply with those regulations. That's something that can help people feel safer online. And I think when people feel safer online, I think the level of trust goes up online. I mean, another aspect of trust online, I think this came up, I'm sure it'll come up this election, and certainly it came up the last two, is you got all these, Twitter accounts that are run by the Russian government or some government. Are these real people? Are they not? I mean, imagine a world where you basically could just have it's like a green, your blue check mark was you actually KYC that you are a real person, or at least held a real passport from the U.S. or somewhere, and but no one had to see that, but you can prove it, right? And then I think people are oh, I'm having a conversation with an actual person, not a bot, and I think that actually improves it improves, the experience that you can have on the web.
Yeah, I think your term hopelessness came up in our survey a bunch of times. Like, essentially, our survey respondents were like, we don't like the current paradigm. We feel like we have no agency to change it. We want new products. No one's making new products, so here we are. Like, that's essentially what our survey captured. So I guess, to start closing this out, like, what can folks in this room who are actually building and thinking about solving real-world problems, like, how can they start addressing some of these issues?
First and foremost thing, and I'm a broken record on this. I think I feel like every conference I ever speak at, I say the same thing. But I mean, the first thing is to remember that despite so all of us are in this room for zkTalks. This talk is about privacy and a privacy survey. It's very important to remember that people, generally speaking, don't make decisions on that basis first and foremost. They make decisions based on things that make their life easier and better. And I think that's actually why we're here, right? Because there's a lot of applications made people's lives easier and better at the expense of privacy, but people used it, right? And I think we just have to remember that it's important that we build with these principles in mind because we share them, and I do think they enable a better version of the web that we have. But it's also critically important that we don't just build a privacy-preserving technology. We build privacy-preserving technology that solves a problem, that is useful, that has utility. Because I think this is my criticism of specifically the privacy space in Web3 is I think a lot of times it's easy to navel gaze and give philosophical speeches about why privacy is important. But until people start using this every day, it's not going to matter. Now, look, though, I'm encouraged by the adoption of, like, take as an example, not in crypto, but end-to-end encrypted messaging. Like, now is the standard, effectively. I mean, and going back even further, the analogy I used earlier, like around SSL, like HTTPS, you can't even go to a website that doesn't use HTTPS. It, like, warns you. So I think, like, as these things get built, and as momentum builds for, or a collective belief that this is important grows, then I think these things start getting baked in. It's a long, slow process, but I do think we have to remember that what we build has to have utility at the end of the day to the users that are going to operate it.
Yeah, I feel like the current conversations around ZK and privacy, actually, there is this moment in time where we can address that paradox, right? People say they want privacy, but they still continue to use products that don't guard their privacy, partly because those products are really great experiences. And I feel like our industry hasn't really come up with what are those great experiences that solve a problem for people.
Totally, and I guess maybe just inspired me to say something else. I mean, this is like, zkTalks, and we talk about ZK and zero knowledge. Like, oftentimes, like, this buzzword becomes like the focus of everything. But like, my grandmother has no idea what zero knowledge is, right? And I would rather show her an application, like an identity application, or it's like, hey, this is how your grandkids can stay safe online without revealing their privacy. Like, I would rather just show that, and then it's just like my grandmother doesn't know how the internet works, but she uses it and loves it, right? And that's, like, being able to show that, I think, is got to be the focus more than, like, we've got a prover that works 10 times faster under certain assumptions. I mean, that's of course great, very important, and it's very important to have an engineering focus, but it's also important to remember there's someone at the end of the tunnel here that uses this stuff. And, frankly, I would advocate strongly to put that person first over the kind of technical, arbitrary technical improvement on this dimension or that dimension.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on, because our last question was actually going to be, what do we do now? And I think that's exactly what we do now. We don't take our eyes off the engineering work and the deep technical work that needs to happen, but we have to bring in the side of whether it's a B2B or B2C, like the end user, whoever it is, like, how are they interacting? Like, I don't know how my toaster works, but I know it makes toast. Like, we shouldn't be in this endless loop of talking about the technology behind the thing that it's supposed to do.
Totally, and I mean, ETHDenver is a place to, the ETHDenver is a place to celebrate and talk about those things, and I'm not saying that. I love to nerd out on various cryptographic protocols. I run a very wonky meetup group, that ZK Study Club, that we talk about research papers. So I love it as much as anyone else, but it's important to remember that, for this to have an impact, people have to use it, and people have to want to use it. And that's, I think, what we need to keep in mind.
Well, thanks, Alex, for being in the hot seat.
That was
and
great.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Yeah, great questions. Thank you, everybody.